Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and LP World. Today, we're going to talk about CDs and vinyl. CDs versus vinyl, or do you love CDs? Do you love vinyl? Do you love both, like myself? So, going back to where I started, I was a little kid. I did start to collect records early on. By the time I was old enough to start buying them myself, I had moved on to cassettes, which seemed more convenient at the time. At the time, probably only had a little boombox anyway. By then, I don't even think our family had a turntable. This is like the mid 80s. Then, when I started to really get into music when I was about 12, when I really started collecting, CDs were just emerging as the new sort of standard. And everyone raved about them, the sound, the clarity, which is all true. So at that point, I was still collecting records, even cassettes sometimes. And by the late 80s, I just had narrowed it down to LPs and CDs. So usually when all the newer bands I liked, or when a band that I enjoyed came out with a new album, I would get it on CD usually, and I was probably collecting used older albums that I would find at reused record stores at that time. Once in a while, I would get an album on vinyl new, and at one point, I had gotten an album called "Ram It Down" from Judas Priest, and it was probably the last new album I got on vinyl at that time. And I just remember it not being happy with the sound at all and thinking to myself, maybe these albums are now being mixed for CD to sound better on CD. So at that point, I stopped buying newer music on vinyl and only bought older albums. And I continued that through the 90s. I never stopped buying vinyl. Everything I bought new was CDs, because I did love CDs. I still do. So like I did collect a lot of vinyl during the 90s. Probably sold half of it at one point in the 90s when I replaced a lot of them with CDs. Then after, I guess, the early 2000s, there was this sort of vinyl revival. Again, I never bought the reissues, just continued to look for older ones. And the reason I always loved vinyl, because to me, as a musician myself, it was the bass and drums that really just hit you, had more of a live sound to me on vinyl. Again, I wouldn't know what the newer albums sounded like on vinyl because, at that point, I wasn't really interested in getting like the Black Album from Metallica on vinyl. Because in my mind, I'm thinking these albums were mixed and produced to be put on CD. Probably since the early 2000s on, that might have changed. But in general, when an artist comes out with an album now, I usually get the CD. I might get the vinyl for whatever reason. But I enjoy mostly vinyl from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I guess early 90s too. If any of the bands I enjoy come out with vinyl now, yeah, I'll buy the album and maybe even the CD also. But I hear a lot of people, or I don't want to say vinyl snobs, but, they go on and on about how much better they sound than CDs. And in some cases, that is true. In general, if you listen to an album from the 70s, it's going to sound better on vinyl than CD. But it's not. But an album in the late 80s throughout the 90s, I don't know. Will it sound the same? Will it sound different? A lot of those albums started to be recorded digitally, so if you have it on vinyl, is it just a vinyl pressing of a digital source? I don't know the specifics of that. I just go by my ears. And here's a perfect example. This is David Lee Roth's Skyscraper. First got this album on cassette in 1988. Was not a great fan of the album. I loved his first album, Eat 'Em and Smile. Bought this and probably in the early 90s I picked this up on CD just to have. I was a pretty big Steve Vai fan at the time. And since then, rarely listened to it. About 3-4 months ago, my local record store I shop at all the time had this in a dollar bin. It had the shrink on it, and the album was absolutely mint. So I was like, okay, for $1, I'll pick it up. I could not believe how good this sounded on vinyl. In fact, it gives you a whole new perspective on the album than the CD. So this is a perfect example where, to me, the album sounds so much better than the CD. And this came out in '88, like I said. So this is just the start of the transition to CDs being the more popular medium. But it's funny because I've never heard anybody comment about the vinyl of this album. So if you ever see this, pick it up because you'll appreciate this album 10 times more than the CD copy. And I'm not saying every album is like that, but in many cases there are. I'm curious to see what an album like the Black Album sounds on vinyl. I don't have it, and I know they're put out now. You can just go to your local Walmart actually and get several of the Metallica albums on vinyl. A couple weeks ago, my friend hosted a poker game, and he had the first Weezer album on vinyl. Same thing, I was blown away with the sound of it. That was an album I've always loved. So that's definitely an album I'm going to probably pick up on vinyl. But the real point of this video, I guess, is that you don't have to just love records. It's okay to be a fan of CDs also. There's this sort of backlash now against CDs as if they're some evil drug or something. But as long as it's not, downloaded music or streamed music, I think CDs are fine. As long as you're happy with how you listen to them. CDs are great also because you could just grab them and put them in the car as well. So there's advantages, not just the sound of it. I still have my first CDs that I bought in 1986. I've played them hundreds of times. They're still perfect condition. Yeah, people do throw CDs around and get them all scratched up. But in general, if you just handle a CD in normal use, it'll last. I don't know if they last forever. I read somewhere that they actually have like a shelf life of 70 years or so. I don't know if they start to deteriorate at some point. I don't know. I'm not sure what the shelf life is of records. I'm sure it's a lot longer in general. But I also want to go into, I see a lot of videos where people have these huge collections, 5,000, 10,000 records, and it's almost as if they're collecting just to collect. I collect CDs and records, but it's also music that I enjoy listening to. I don't just buy an album because it's a limited edition album and I just want to collect it, or I want to have this artist's discography because he was a great jazz artist or something. I buy records and CDs that I'm going to listen to. So I don't have a huge collection like most people do, or most people that make these videos. And I've noticed too, a lot of people are buying reissues, whereas I like to find an original copy of an album in good condition. That's just me. And part of the pleasure I get out of collecting is going out and finding them, as opposed to just ordering it online or even finding an old copy on eBay, which I will do from time to time if it's something I've never found. But I just like to go to record stores and look through and say, oh, I remember that album. I should pick that up. Or, I never heard this before. I wonder how this sounds. And like I said before in past videos, I'm pretty lucky where I am. There's a lot of good record stores that you can get vinyl at a reasonable price to even just try out stuff. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are on vinyl versus CD. I've seen some of the scientific tests about dynamic range and this and that, and it turns out that CDs actually have more dynamic range, but in turn most people think that albums sound warmer, which I do agree with. It depends on the source too. like I said before, personally, I don't really have an interest of getting the Black Album from Metallica on vinyl. Would I like to hear it just out of curiosity to see what it sounds like? But it's not an album where it's like, oh, I have to have that on vinyl because the CD sounds so great. And I mean, I guess it goes along with being audiophile too, which I'm not claiming to be. I have like a, pretty modest system compared to what most people have on the on YouTube here. But I think it sounds pretty good to me. So just share your thoughts. And, what it comes down to, a lot of it is, this is a lot cooler than this. And, it might even sound better. So, again, let me know your thoughts. Thanks a lot.